Phone rings at 3 a.m. It's never good news at 3 in the morning. For a man who controls the quiet, brutal underbelly of the city, a late-night call usually means blood on the pavement or a shipment seized by the feds. Gabriel didn't expect the deadpan voice of a desk sergeant. He certainly didn't expect the name of the inmate using her one phone call. His secretary, the woman who color-codes his schedule and drinks tepid chamomile tea, was sitting in a downtown holding cell, and she wanted him. Gabriel Rossi did not sleep. He took brief, tactical pauses of unconsciousness, usually ending before the sun came up. When the encrypted burner phone on his nightstand vibrated against the mahogany, his eyes snapped open. The digital clock read 3:04 a.m. He didn't scramble. He sat up, the heavy silk sheets falling away from his chest, and answered on the second ring. He expected the harsh, clipped voice of his lieutenant reporting a disaster at the docks. "Rossi," he said. His voice was gravel, stripped of any inflection. "Yeah, is this Gabriel Rossi?" The voice on the other end was nasal bored and chewed through the vowels. "I'm calling from the 12th precinct. We got a Jane Doe here who finally gave us a name and a contact. Says you're her employer." Gabriel went perfectly still. The 12th precinct. He ran through a mental ledger of his men. None of them were stupid enough to give the cops Gabriel's direct number. "Who is it?" "Name's Nora Hayes. Booked on aggravated assault and disturbing the peace. Bail set, but she refused a lawyer. Just said to call this number." Nora. Gabriel stared at the blank wall across his bedroom. Nora Hayes. His secretary. The woman who had spent the last 3 years organizing his life with terrifying, quiet efficiency. Nora wore sensible beige trench coats. Nora bought him black coffee exactly 4 minutes before he walked into the office. Nora filed offshore banking documents with the same blank expression she used to order printer toner. Nora did not get arrested for aggravated assault. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Gabriel said. He hung up. The city was drowning in a cold, relentless autumn rain when Gabriel's black SUV pulled up to the curb outside the 12th. Frankie, his driver, kept the engine running. Frankie hadn't asked questions, but the heavy silence in the car spoke volumes. Gabriel stepped out into the downpour, ignoring the umbrella Frankie offered. The cold water felt appropriate. It matched the sudden, sharp shift in his reality. The precinct smelled exactly the way a police station at 3:30 a.m. always smells: damp wool, stale burnt coffee, ammonia, and human desperation. Gabriel pushed through the heavy glass doors. His tailored charcoal suit felt like armor in the fluorescent purgatory of the waiting room. A desk sergeant sat behind thick, scratched plexiglass, typing slowly with 2 fingers. "I'm here for Nora Hayes." Gabriel said, his tone low enough that the sergeant had to stop typing and look up. The cop sized him up. The suit, the watch, the absolute lack of movement in Gabriel's posture. Cops knew when they were looking at money, and they knew when they were looking at danger. Gabriel was both. "You her lawyer?" the sergeant asked, pulling a clipboard closer. "I'm her boss. The bail, $5,000, cash or bond." Gabriel pulled a sleek black money clip from his interior pocket. He counted out $50 bills and slid them through the narrow slot under the glass. "Process it." The wait took 12 minutes. Gabriel didn't sit on the plastic chairs. He stood by the wall, watching the hallway that led back to the holding cells. He was trying to construct a scenario where Nora Hayes found herself in a street brawl, and his imagination, usually capable of picturing the worst violence humanity had to offer, completely failed him. Then the heavy metal door clicked and swung open. A female officer walked out, leading her. Gabriel felt a strange, tight pull in the center of his chest. It was Nora. But it wasn't the Nora he saw every day at 8 a.m. Her hair, usually pulled back in a severe, unforgiving clasp, had come loose, falling in damp, chaotic waves around her shoulders. She was wearing her standard white button-down, but the top 3 buttons were torn off, revealing a bruised collarbone. Her beige coat was missing, but it was her hands that caught his eye. Her right hand was wrapped in a crude, bloody gauze, the knuckles swollen to twice their size. She stopped when she saw him. Her dark eyes, usually completely unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses, flickered. There was no shame in her gaze, no tears, just a tired, flat acknowledgement. She didn't look like a woman who had just been bailed out by the head of a criminal syndicate. She looked like an employee, annoyed that she had to work overtime. "Mr. Rossi," she said. Her voice was raspy. Gabriel closed the distance between them. He stood over her, his presence suffocating, blocking out the cops and the glare of the lights. He looked down at her bleeding knuckles, then up to the faint swelling on her left cheekbone. "Nora," he said quietly, the word carrying a dangerous edge. "Are you going to tell me why I'm buying you out of a cage at 4 in the morning?" She looked down at her ruined hand, then back up at him. It was a disagreement. A disagreement. Gabriel repeated, his voice dropping an octave. "Yes." She adjusted the torn collar of her shirt, a futile gesture of modesty. "Can we leave the coffee here? Is a violation of human rights." Gabriel stared at her for a long, heavy second. He realized he didn't know the woman standing in front of him at all. He turned to the desk sergeant, grabbed the release paperwork, and looked back at her. Cars outside. The rain hammered against the roof of the SUV, a chaotic drumbeat that filled the heavy silence. Frankie navigated the slick, deserted downtown streets with practiced ease, keeping his eyes firmly locked on the road ahead. The glass partition, separating the front from the back, was up. Nora sat as far away from Gabriel as the leather bench seat allowed. She was staring out the window at the blurred streetlights, her bleeding hand resting lightly on her knee. She was shivering, though she was trying very hard to hide it. Gabriel watched her. He had spent his entire life reading people. He survived by knowing exactly what a man was going to do 3 seconds before he did it. He looked for tells, a twitch, a shift in breathing, a break in eye contact. Nora gave him nothing. She was a locked vault. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, took it off and tossed it across the seat. It landed next to her. "Put it on," he said. She glanced at the jacket, the expensive wool still carrying his heat. "I'm fine, Mr. Rossi." "You're shaking, Nora. Put the jacket on. That's an order." She tightened her jaw, a subtle flex of defiance, but picked up the coat and draped it over her shoulders. She looked small inside it, swallowed up by the dark fabric, but she stopped trembling. "Talk," Gabriel said. He leaned back against the leather, his arms crossed. Nora kept her eyes on the window. "I went to a bar. The neon sign said they had good gin." The neon sign was lying. "Don't play with me, Nora. Aggravated assault. You put a man in the hospital. The sergeant told me while you were signing out. Broken orbital bone, shattered jaw, and a concussion. They say you used an ashtray." It was a heavy ashtray. Nora. Her name was a warning. She finally turned to look at him. In the passing flashes of the streetlights, the bruising on her cheek looked darker, angry. A man approached me at the bar. He was persistent. I politely declined his company. He decided polite wasn't an answer he wanted to accept. Gabriel felt a cold, jagged spike of anger lodge itself in his ribs. "He touched you." He grabbed my arm. She gestured vaguely to her torn collar. "Tried to pull me out the back door." Said he was going to show me a good time whether I was in the mood or not. So you beat him half to death. I hit him until he stopped holding on to me. She corrected her voice deadpan. He just happened to hold on for a remarkably long time. Gabriel let out a slow, controlled breath. He was accustomed to violence. He orchestrated it. He paid for it. But hearing this woman who reminded him when to send his mother flowers, who meticulously redacted his financial ledgers, describe bludgeoning a man with clinical detachment, sent a strange shock wave through his system. "Why didn't you call the police?" Gabriel asked. Nora let out a short, cynical bark of a laugh. It was a sound he had never heard from her. "The police, Mr. Rossi, you of all people know how the police handle a woman complaining about a man at a bar. By the time they arrived, I would have been in an alley. I handled it." "You handled it?" "Yes." Gabriel leaned forward, closing the space between them. He reached out and gently, deliberately took her injured hand. She flinched instinctively, trying to pull back, but his grip was firm. He looked at the crude gauze the precinct nurse had slapped on her knuckles. Blood was already seeping through the cheap white cotton. "You don't know how to throw a punch," Gabriel muttered, inspecting the swelling. "You hit him with the wrong part of your hand. You're going to have hairline fractures in your ring and pinky fingers." "I'll type with my thumbs on Monday," she replied without missing a beat. Gabriel's eyes snapped up to hers. They were mere inches apart. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't looking at his secretary. He was looking at a survivor. Someone who operated on the same grim, pragmatic frequency that he did. The realization was profound and incredibly dangerous. "Who was he?" Gabriel asked softly. Nora hesitated. Her gaze dropped to his hands holding hers. "Does it matter? He's a nobody. If he's a nobody, you wouldn't be avoiding my eyes." Gabriel squeezed her wrist just enough to demand her attention. "Who was he, Nora?" She swallowed hard. "He recognized me. Or rather, he recognized who I work for." When I told him to back off, he laughed. He said he worked for the Moretti crew. He said taking Rossi's little secretary for a ride would be a nice bonus for his week. Gabriel went completely rigid. The Moretti crew. They were a mid-level outfit, currently pushing into his territory on the south side. They were a nuisance he had been planning to deal with next month. They had touched his secretary. They had used his name while doing it. The air in the SUV dropped 10 degrees. Gabriel let go of her hand and leaned back, pulling out his burner phone. His face was an absolute void. It was the face men saw right before their lives ended. "What are you doing?" Nora asked, the first hint of genuine alarm creeping into her voice. "Making a call," Gabriel said flatly. "Gabriel, don't." He froze. His thumb hovered over the keypad. She had never used his first name. Not once in 3 years. It felt strange in her mouth, intimate and raw. "Don't what?" he asked, his voice a dangerous whisper. "Don't turn this into a war. I took care of it. I left him bleeding on the floor. It's done. It's not done until I say it's done," Gabriel replied, the mob boss finally bleeding through the veneer of the businessman. He put his hands on what's mine. The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded. "What's mine?" Nora stared at him, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The boundary between employer and employee had just been shattered ground into glass dust and scattered onto the floorboards of the car. Gabriel dialed the phone. "Frankie," he called out to the front seat. "We aren't going to her apartment. We're going to the penthouse. Call the private doctor. Tell him to meet us there." The private elevator to the top floor of the Rossi Tower hummed with a low, expensive vibration. It was the only sound in the confined space. Gabriel stood near the control panel, his posture rigid. Nora stood in the opposite corner, still swallowed by his charcoal suit jacket. She stared straight ahead at the brushed steel doors. She looked exhausted. The adrenaline that had kept her upright in the precinct was bleeding out, leaving behind a profound physical fatigue. Gabriel watched her reflection in the metal doors. He noticed the way she subtly shifted her weight off her left leg, the slight grimace she failed to suppress. The bastard at the bar had done more than just grab her arm. The doors chimed and parted, revealing the penthouse. It was a vast, sprawling space of cold minimalism. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline, a jagged expanse of black and neon weeping under the relentless rain. The furniture was low-slung dark leather and gunmetal grey. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress with a view. "Sit," Gabriel said, pointing to a long leather sofa in the center of the room. Nora didn't argue. She walked over and sank into the cushions, her injured hand resting awkwardly on her lap. Gabriel walked to a heavy mahogany wet bar, poured 2 fingers of scotch into a crystal glass, and carried it over to her. "Drink," he ordered. She took the glass with her good hand. She didn't sip it. She threw it back like it was medicine, handing the empty glass back to him without a word. The soft chime of the service elevator echoed through the room. Frankie walked in, followed closely by a thin, balding man carrying a scuffed leather medical bag. Dr. Thomas Evans was a man who asked no questions, charged exorbitant fees, and never documented his late-night house calls. "Gabriel." Dr. Evans nodded, setting his bag on the glass coffee table. He looked at Nora, his professional mask slipping for a fraction of a second in surprise. He was used to patching up heavily tattooed enforcers with bullet wounds, not women in torn office attire. "Her right hand," Gabriel said, his voice flat. "And check her ribs. She's favoring her left side." Nora shot Gabriel a sharp look. She hadn't said a word about her ribs. He ignored her glare. "Let's take a look, miss," Evans murmured, pulling up a low stool. Gabriel did not leave the room. He stood a few feet away, leaning against the edge of a heavy oak desk, his arms crossed over his chest. He watched intently as Evans unwrapped the crude blood-soaked gauze the police nurse had applied. Under the harsh light of the modern chandelier, the damage was ugly. The skin across her knuckles was split and peeling back. The flesh was swollen, colored in angry shades of purple and black. Evans probed the joints with gloved fingers. Nora sucked in a sharp breath through her teeth, her good hand gripping the leather of the sofa. But she didn't make a sound. Gabriel felt a muscle in his jaw jump. He wanted to tell the doctor to be careful. He wanted to break something. The violence humming under his skin was a familiar companion, but the protective territorial edge attached to it was entirely new. Hairline fracture on the 4th metacarpal. Dr. Evans concluded, reaching into his bag for antiseptic and a splint. "And the skin is badly macerated. You hit something hard." "A skull," Nora said simply. Evans paused, looked up at her, then back down at her hand. "Right. Well, it's going to hurt for a while. I need to clean these abrasions thoroughly. It will sting." "Go ahead." Gabriel watched her face as the doctor applied the iodine. Her eyes watered, but she kept her jaw locked tight. She was tougher than half the men on his payroll. For 3 years she had been a ghost in his periphery, a highly efficient, quiet ghost who managed his chaotic life with 0 friction. He realized with a cold jolt of clarity that he had never actually looked at her. He had seen the beige coats, the glasses, the severe hair. He had never seen the steel underneath. "Let me see the ribs," Evans said, finishing the bandage on her hand. Nora hesitated. She looked at Gabriel. It was a clear dismissal. Gabriel didn't move. He met her gaze, his dark eyes unyielding. "I've seen worse, Nora. Let him look." A faint flush crept up her neck, coloring the unbruised side of her face. She unbuttoned the remaining buttons of her ruined white shirt, pulling the fabric aside just enough to expose her left ribcage. Gabriel stopped breathing. A massive, ugly bruise was blooming across her pale skin, shaped perfectly like the toe of a heavy boot. The guy hadn't just grabbed her, he had kicked her. The silence in the penthouse turned lethal. The air pressure seemed to drop. Evans swallowed audibly, pressing gently against her ribs. "Nothing broken," the doctor said, his voice a little too fast. "Deep tissue contusion. It's going to be painful to breathe deeply or laugh. I'll leave some painkillers." "Thank you, doctor," Gabriel said. The words sounded like they were dragged over broken glass. Evans packed his bag in record time. Frankie escorted him back to the service elevator. The heavy doors closed, leaving Gabriel and Nora alone in the sprawling, quiet room. Nora slowly buttoned her shirt with her left hand, wincing as her ribs protested the movement. She pulled Gabriel's large jacket tighter around her shoulders. Gabriel walked to the window, turning his back to her. He needed to look at the city, at the rain, at anything other than the bruise on her ribs. "You're staying here tonight?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Mr. Rossi, I have an apartment. I have clothes. I have an alarm set for 6:30. "Cancel the alarm. You aren't going to the office tomorrow." Gabriel turned around to face her. "And my name is Gabriel. You used it in the car. Keep using it." Nora looked up at him, the exhaustion finally pulling at the corners of her eyes. She didn't have the energy to fight him. She leaned her head back against the sofa and closed her eyes. "Fine," she whispered. Gabriel, hearing his name in that quiet, defeated tone, did something dangerous to his chest. He walked over, picked up a heavy cashmere throw from an armchair, and draped it over her legs. He didn't say another word. He just sat in the armchair opposite her, watching her breathe in the dim light, and waited for the sun to come up. Nora woke to the smell of coffee. For a disorienting second, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling was too high, the silence too absolute. Then the dull, throbbing ache in her right hand and the sharp stab in her ribs provided a violent reminder. She opened her eyes. She was still on the leather sofa. Sunlight, pale and grey, filtered through the massive windows. The rain had stopped, leaving the city looking washed out and raw. She pushed herself up, biting back a groan as her ribs protested. She was still wearing her ruined shirt and Gabriel's suit jacket. She swung her legs over the side of the sofa and looked around. Gabriel was standing at the kitchen island at the far end of the open concept room. He was out of the charcoal suit, wearing dark sweatpants and a tight black t-shirt that clung to the heavy muscle of his shoulders. He was pouring coffee from a French press into 2 matte black mugs. He looked up as she moved. "Sit," he called out, his voice quiet, but carrying easily across the room. "I'll bring it over." Nora ignored the order. She stood waiting for a wave of dizziness to pass and walked slowly toward the kitchen. She wasn't an invalid, and she refused to be treated like one. She approached the marble island and took the mug he pushed toward her. "Black," Gabriel said. "No sugar. Exactly how you make mine. Thank you." She wrapped her good hand around the warm ceramic. She took a sip. It was perfect. Strong, bitter hot. Gabriel leaned his hip against the counter, holding his own mug. He watched her drink. The predatory stillness that usually surrounded him was muted this morning, replaced by something calculated and heavy. "His name is Leo Moretti," Gabriel said abruptly. Nora froze the mug halfway to her mouth. She slowly lowered it to the counter. You looked into it. Of course I looked into it. I don't let things like this go. Gabriel took a slow drink of his coffee. He's the nephew of Paulie Moretti, the boss. Leo is stupid careless and has a habit of making messes his uncle has to clean up. He's currently sitting in Mercy Hospital with his jaw wired shut. Nora looked down at the dark liquid in her cup. If he's the boss's nephew, me putting him in the hospital is going to be a problem. It's my problem. No, Gabriel. She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. It's a business problem. The Morettis have been encroaching on the South Side docks for 2 months. If you retaliate violently for this, Paulie will use it as an excuse to go to war over the territory. He'll claim you broke the truce over a bar fight. Gabriel narrowed his eyes. The fact that she knew about the South Side dock dispute wasn't entirely surprising. She managed his schedule, she knew who he met with. The fact that she was actively analyzing street-level mob politics while standing in his kitchen with a broken hand, however, was fascinating. So what do you suggest to Nora? He asked, testing her. Let him walk after he put his hands on you. The anger spiked in his voice again, hard and undeniable. I suggest you hit them where they actually feel it, Nora said flatly. She leaned against the marble, ignoring the twinge in her side. Leo runs their illegal sports betting operation out of the back of that meatpacking plant on 4th Street. Right. Gabriel stared at her. How do you know that? I balance your books. I notice when our street runners complain about losing foot traffic in certain neighborhoods. I pay attention. Nora took another sip of her coffee. You don't need to shoot anyone. You just need to bankrupt him. Gabriel set his mug down. He crossed his arms, giving her his full, undivided attention. Go on. Leo is an idiot. You said it yourself. He's definitely skimming off the top of his uncle's take. It's what entitled nephews do. Nora's voice was completely detached, analytical. The secretary was gone. A strategist had taken her place. We leak his actual betting ledgers to Paulie. We prove Leo is stealing from the family. Paulie is a greedy, paranoid old man. If he thinks his own blood is robbing him, he won't declare war on you. He'll take care of Leo himself. The penthouse was completely silent. Gabriel stared at the woman standing in front of him. Her hair was a tangled mess. She had a black eye forming on her cheek and a hand wrapped in thick white gauze. Yet she stood there with absolute authority, calmly explaining how to dismantle a rival Mafia captain using forensic accounting and family paranoia. Gabriel felt a slow, dark smile pull at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a man who had just found a lethal weapon he didn't know he owned. And how exactly do we get our hands on Leo's private ledgers? Gabriel asked softly. Nora looked at him, her dark eyes completely unreadable. I already have them. Gabriel went perfectly still. Excuse me, about 3 weeks ago, one of Leo's bookies got sloppy. Left a decrypted flash drive at a diner in our territory. Frankie brought it to the office, didn't know what to do with it. Nora shrugged her good shoulder. I copied the files. I've been running the numbers on my lunch breaks. I built a comprehensive spreadsheet of Leo's embezzlement. I was going to put it in your Friday briefing folder. Gabriel let out a low, rough laugh. It was a sound of pure disbelief. You were going to put the financial ruin of a Mafia captain in my Friday briefing folder, between the dry cleaning receipts and the meeting notes. It seemed relevant to the business. Gabriel pushed off the counter. He walked toward her, closing the distance until he was standing mere inches away. Nora didn't step back. She held her ground, looking up at him, the top of her head barely reaching his collarbone. You! Gabriel murmured, his voice dropping to a gravelly register. "Are terrifying." "I'm organized," she corrected. He reached up. Slowly, deliberately, he brushed a stray lock of hair away from her bruised cheek. His fingertips lingered on her skin, surprisingly gentle for a man whose hands had ended lives. The touch sent a physical jolt through Nora, a sudden spike of heat that had nothing to do with her injuries. "You aren't going back to the front desk, Nora," Gabriel said, his eyes tracing the line of her jaw. "When you heal, you're moving into the inner office. With me." She looked at him, her breath hitching slightly as his thumb grazed her cheekbone. The boundary they had shattered in the SUV was completely pulverized now. There was no going back to Mr. Rossi. "I'll need a new chair," she whispered. "The one in the inner office lacks lumbar support." Gabriel smiled again. He leaned in the scent of cedar and dark coffee wrapping around her. "I'll buy you the whole damn building." For the next 48 hours, the penthouse became a gilded cage. Gabriel did not allow Nora to leave. He didn't lock the doors, but the implication was clear: she was under his protection, and his protection did not extend past the reinforced steel of the private elevator. Nora hated it. She was a creature of habit, entirely dependent on the rigid structure of her routines. Here, floating 50 stories above the city in a hyper-modern vacuum, she was unmoored. Her ribs ached with a dull, persistent throb. Her hand, tightly bound in a fresh fiberglass splint, felt like a useless, heavy club. Gabriel, however, seemed entirely in his element. He shifted his base of operations to the penthouse dining table. He sat in a high-backed leather chair, a phone pressed to his ear, orchestrating the quiet, brutal machinery of his syndicate. Nora watched him from the sofa. She had worked for him for 3 years, but always through the filter of the outer office. She had managed the results of his orders, the payouts, the cleanups, the strategic investments. Now she was watching the genesis of those orders. Gabriel was entirely ruthless, speaking in low, measured tones that carried an absolute, undeniable authority. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just stated facts, and the men on the other end of the line scrambled to align reality with his words. On the afternoon of the second day, Frankie arrived carrying a slim metallic briefcase. He set it on the dining table, his eyes darting briefly toward Nora, who was pretending to read a thick hardcover book on architectural history. Frankie looked confused. The men in Gabriel's inner circle didn't know what to make of the secretary lounging on the boss's private sofa in his sweatpants. "I got it," Frankie said, tapping the briefcase. "The drive." Gabriel didn't look at it. He looked at Nora. "Come here." She closed the book and stood moving carefully to avoid jarring her ribs. She walked over to the table and looked down at the silver case. "Open it," Gabriel told Frankie. Frankie popped the latches. Inside, resting on dark foam, was a single black USB drive. Nora built the file. Gabriel said, his voice flat. "Explain the drop, Frankie." Frankie shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable taking operational notes regarding the boss's secretary. "We got a guy inside Paulie Moretti's social club in Little Italy. A busboy. He sweeps the private back room where Paulie plays cards every Tuesday night. The drive gets taped under Paulie's specific chair. Paulie finds it. He plugs it in. He sees the spreadsheets. He sees his nephew has been stealing $250,000 a month from the sports books." "And the metadata?" Nora asked. Frankie blinked. "The what?" "The metadata on the files." Nora repeated her voice, returning to its familiar, clipped, professional tone. "If Paulie's IT guys look at the creation dates, they need to see that the files were compiled on a machine registered to Leo's front company. If it traces back to one of our IP addresses, Paulie will know it's a setup. Frankie looked at Gabriel. Gabriel was watching Nora with a look of quiet, intense fascination. "It's clean," Gabriel said softly, answering for his lieutenant. "I had the tech guys scrub it exactly how you wrote it down on the notepad this morning." Nora nodded once. "Then it's ready. He plays cards at 9. He'll find it by 10. You should expect fallout by tomorrow morning." "Drop it," Gabriel ordered Frankie. Frankie snapped the briefcase shut and headed for the elevator. The doors chimed, and the penthouse was plunged back into its heavy, suffocating silence. Gabriel turned his chair, slightly facing her. He reached out and caught her left wrist, gently pulling her closer until she was standing between his knees. It was a deeply territorial posture. Nora's breath hitched, but she didn't pull away. "You don't flinch," Gabriel murmured. He looked up into her face. "You just handed down a death sentence to a Mafia captain. Paulie doesn't forgive theft. He'll kill his own nephew. And you didn't even blink." Nora looked down at him. The air between them felt thick, charged with the same static electricity that precedes a violent storm. Leo Moretti made a miscalculation in a bar. He assumed he held all the power. I am simply correcting his math. Gabriel let out a low sound in the back of his throat, something between a laugh and a groan. He slid his hand up her arm, his thumb tracing the inside of her elbow. The touch was completely incongruous with the conversation. It was soft. Lethal men were rarely soft. "You've been sitting outside my door for 3 years, Gabriel said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Handling my dry cleaning, making my coffee. And all this time you had ice in your veins. I am very good at my job, Gabriel. Your job just changed." He tightened his grip slightly, pulling her an inch closer. "You're done answering phones. You're done managing the calendar. From now on, you sit at the table. You see the board. I don't know anything about running the streets." "I know the streets," Gabriel replied, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "You know the numbers. You see the angles. We are going to dismantle the Moretti family, Nora. And you are going to draw the blueprints." Nora swallowed hard. She was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into a terrifying, pitch-black abyss. But as Gabriel's thumb slowly stroked her skin, she realized something even more frightening. She wanted to jump. The news hit the streets 48 hours later. It didn't make the morning papers. It made the whispers, the encrypted texts, the hushed conversations in the backs of butcher shops and dimly lit social clubs. Leo Moretti had been found in the trunk of a stolen sedan, parked at the long-term lot of the international airport. He had 2 bullets in the back of his head, and his hands had been severed, the traditional Cosa Nostra punishment for a thief. Uncle Paulie had cleaned his own house. Gabriel was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window of the penthouse, watching the city wake up under a bruised purple sky. He held a cup of black coffee. He had received the call from Frankie 10 minutes ago. The plan had worked flawlessly. The Moretti crew was in chaos, bleeding from a self-inflicted wound, and Gabriel hadn't had to fire a single shot. Nora walked out of the guest bedroom. The swelling on her cheek had faded to a sickly yellow, and she was moving with more fluidity, her ribs slowly knitting back together. She was wearing a pair of Gabriel's black silk pajama pants, cinched tightly at the waist, and a grey cashmere sweater she had scavenged from his closet. "It's done," Gabriel said without turning around. Nora stopped near the kitchen island. She didn't ask for clarification. She knew exactly what he meant. "Has Paulie reached out?" "Not yet." Gabriel took a sip of his coffee. "He's burying his blood, but he's not stupid. The timing of the ledger leak right after Leo got his jaw broken in my territory. Paulie knows I pushed the domino. He just can't prove it. And he can't retaliate because Leo actually was stealing from him. He'll call a meeting, Nora said. It wasn't a guess. It was a calculation. Gabriel finally turned around. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. He'll demand a sit-down, to save face, to establish that, despite the internal mess, he still holds power. Where? Neutral ground. Probably the old steakhouses downtown, the ones with the private cellars. Gabriel set his mug on the glass table. I need to get dressed. 2 hours later, the penthouse felt different. The quiet domesticity of the past few days had evaporated, replaced by cold, hard tension. Gabriel emerged from his master suite wearing a 3-piece suit the color of wet asphalt. The tailoring was flawless, designed to hide the bulk of the shoulder holster he wore underneath. He looked exactly like the man the city feared. He stood in front of the hallway mirror, struggling slightly to fasten his left cufflink. Nora watched him from the sofa. She set down the tablet she had been reading. She walked over to him, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. "Let me," she said quietly. Gabriel dropped his hands to his sides. He turned slightly, allowing her into his space. Nora reached up with her good left hand. Her fingers were deft, manipulating the heavy silver mechanism with practiced ease. She had done this 100 times before in the office, fixing a crooked tie or brushing lint from his lapel before a major meeting. But this time it was different. There was no desk between them. There were no ringing phones. There was only the heavy rhythmic sound of Gabriel's breathing and the distinct smell of gunpowder oil radiating from the weapon strapped to his ribs. She fastened the link and smoothed the crisp white cotton of his cuff. She didn't pull her hand away immediately. Her fingers lingered on his wrist, feeling the slow, steady thrum of his pulse. Gabriel looked down at her. "Tell me how to play him, Nora?" He wasn't testing her this time. He was asking. The realization sent a shiver down her spine. The most dangerous man in the city was asking for her strategic counsel before walking into a room full of wolves. "Paulie is bleeding," Nora said, keeping her eyes on his cuff. "He looks weak to the other families because he had to kill his own nephew. He'll try to compensate by being aggressive with you. He'll demand a concession on the South Side docks, just a sliver. Something he can take back to his captains to prove he still has teeth." "I don't give away my territory," Gabriel said, his voice a low rumble in his chest. "I know." Nora finally looked up, meeting his dark, intense gaze. "So you offer him a phantom concession. You offer him a percentage of the freight loading fees on Pier 4. Gabriel narrowed his eyes. "Pier 4 is being condemned by the city next month for structural failure. The union is pulling all the workers out." "Exactly," Nora said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But the public notices haven't been filed yet. It's buried in municipal zoning paperwork. Paulie won't know. You reluctantly give him Pier 4. He walks away thinking he squeezed you. By the time he realizes he owns a piece of a rotting, condemned dock, the tension will have passed, and he won't be able to start a war over a zoning issue without looking completely incompetent." Gabriel stared at her. The absolute brilliance of it, the cold bureaucratic violence of weaponizing city zoning laws against a mafia don was staggering. He reached out his large hands, gripping her waist. He pulled her flush against him. Nora gasped, her hands instinctively, coming up to rest flat against his chest, right over the hard leather of his holster. "You," Gabriel murmured, his face inches from hers, "are a masterpiece." He didn't wait for a response. He leaned down and captured her mouth. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was a collision. It was 3 years of ignored tension, fueled by adrenaline, and the dark, violent reality they had just plunged into together. Gabriel's mouth was hot, demanding, tasting of dark coffee and danger. Nora froze for a fraction of a second before kissing him back with a fierce, unexpected desperation. Her good hand slid up his chest, gripping the lapel of his suit, anchoring herself to him. Gabriel groaned a low, territorial sound, backing her up until her shoulders hit the wall beside the mirror. He broke the kiss just enough to breathe his lips brushing against her jawline. "I'm coming back for you," he whispered roughly against her skin. "Lock the elevator." The private cellar of Lombardi's steakhouse smelled of dry-aged beef, spilled Barolo, and decades of quiet corruption. The heavy oak doors were shut, guarded on the outside by 4 men who didn't speak to each other. Gabriel sat at the head of a long, scarred mahogany table. He didn't touch the glass of water in front of him. He kept his hands flat on the wood, projecting an absolute, terrifying stillness. Across from him sat Paulie Moretti. The older Don looked awful. The skin around his eyes was the color of bruised plums, sagging with the heavy, inescapable weight of ordering a hit on his own blood. But Paulie was a creature of pride, and grief had curdled into a vicious, unpredictable rage. He puffed on a thick cigar, the cherry glowing like a warning light in the dim room. "I cleaned up the mess," Paulie said. His voice was a wet rasp, destroyed by years of cheap whiskey and expensive tobacco. "Leo was a thief. He stole from the family. He paid the toll. But you and I both know the timing of those ledgers hitting my desk wasn't a coincidence, Rossi. You forced my hand." Gabriel didn't blink. He leaned forward just an inch. It was enough to shift the gravity in the room. "Leo put his hands on my employee. In my territory. I didn't force your hand, Paulie. I did you a favor. I showed you the rat in your walls before he chewed through your foundation. You should be thanking me." Paulie slammed his fist onto the table. The water glasses rattled. "You humiliated my bloodline. You think you can engineer a hit on a Moretti and walk away clean? I look weak. My captains are restless. I need balance, Gabriel. I need restitution." There it was, the demand. Gabriel felt a strange, cold thrill run through his veins. It was exactly as Nora had predicted. Every word out of the old man's mouth was following the script she had written while sitting in his pajamas in the penthouse. "I don't pay restitution for a problem I didn't start," Gabriel said, his tone turning hard, uncompromising. "Then we go to the mattresses," Paulie snarled, leaning over the table. "You think you can handle a war on 3 fronts right now? You think your men want to bleed over a secretary?" Gabriel let the silence stretch. He let Paulie steep in his own adrenaline. He calculated the exact number of seconds required to make a concession look agonizing. "I don't want a war over a dead thief," Gabriel finally said, lowering his voice, letting a note of manufactured reluctance bleed into his tone. "The South Side docks. You've been pushing for a foothold. I'll give you Pier 4. The freight loading fees are yours. You put your own men on the gates. You collect the envelopes. We draw the line there." Paulie paused. The cigar smoke drifted between them in thick, lazy coils. The older Don's eyes narrowed, searching Gabriel's face for the trick. He found nothing. Pier 4 was a high-volume dock. It was a massive concession. It was a victory Paulie could take back to his crew to prove he had squeezed the untouchable Gabriel Rossi. "Pier 4, Paulie repeated. He leaned back in his chair, the aggressive posture dissolving into a grim satisfaction. "You pull your men off by midnight. Done," Gabriel said. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He didn't offer his hand. You didn't shake hands with a man who had just murdered his nephew. "Keep your dogs on a leash, Paulie. I won't be this generous twice." Gabriel walked out of the cellar, The air in the alleyway was cold, biting through the fine wool of his suit, but it felt clean. He slid into the back of the waiting SUV. Frankie put the car in drive before the door even clicked shut. "Well?" Frankie asked, looking at Gabriel in the rearview mirror. "She was right," Gabriel said softly, looking out at the blur of the city lights. Every single word. He took Pier 4. "Christ," Frankie muttered, shaking his head. "When the city drops that condemnation notice, Paulie is going to have an aneurysm." Gabriel didn't respond. He just watched the rain start to fall again, his mind entirely focused on the penthouse. When the private elevator doors chimed and parted, the apartment was dark, save for the ambient glow of the city filtering through the glass. Gabriel took off his suit jacket, tossing it onto an armchair. He unholstered his weapon, placing it on the console table with a heavy metallic clack. Nora was standing by the window. She turned when she heard the gun hit the table. She was still wearing his sweater, her dark hair falling loose over her shoulders. The bruising on her face looked stark in the low light. "He took it," Gabriel said. He walked across the room, stopping 2 feet away from her. "He took the pier. He thinks he won." Nora let out a slow, controlled breath. The tension that had been holding her spine rigid finally snapped, leaving her suddenly exhausted. "It buys us time, at least a month before the zoning board makes the filings public." "It buys us leverage," Gabriel corrected. He closed the remaining distance between them. He reached out his large hands, cupping her face. He didn't care about the bruises. He didn't care about the bandages. He looked at her like she was the only real thing in a city made of ghosts. "You did this," he murmured, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. "You broke a Mafia family with a zoning ordinance." Nora looked up into his dark, violent eyes. The fear she should have felt was completely absent, replaced by a dark, terrifying rush of adrenaline. She reached up with her good hand, curling her fingers into the soft cotton of his shirt. Gabriel leaned down and kissed her. It was slower this time, heavier. It was a seal on a contract they had both silently agreed to. Nora kissed him back, letting the cold logic of her mind shut down, surrendering to the brutal, undeniable heat of the man holding her. She was no longer watching the underworld from a desk. She had just built a throne in the middle of it. Monday morning arrived with the harsh, unforgiving glare of a clear sky. When Gabriel's black SUV pulled up to the curb outside the Rossi corporate tower, the atmosphere shifted. Frankie opened the rear door. Gabriel stepped out first, adjusting the cuffs of his navy suit. Then he turned and offered his hand to the dark interior. Nora stepped onto the pavement. She wasn't wearing beige. She wore a tailored charcoal grey pantsuit, the cut sharp enough to draw blood. Her hair was pulled back into its usual severe clasp, but the thick, black-rimmed sunglasses she wore to hide the fading yellow bruise on her cheek gave her an entirely different aura. Her right hand was still encased in the white fiberglass splint. She ignored Gabriel's hand. She didn't need help standing. They walked into the lobby together. The security guards, the receptionists, the low-level runners disguised as couriers, everyone stopped. They were used to seeing Nora trailing 2 steps behind Gabriel, carrying a tablet and a coffee. Today she walked beside him. The physical distance between them had vanished. They moved as a single cohesive unit. The elevator ride to the executive floor was completely silent. Frankie stood in the corner, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor indicator. He had seen the way Gabriel looked at her over the weekend. The men in the crew weren't idiots. The hierarchy had shifted violently and permanently. The doors opened. Nora's old desk sat in the center of the reception area. It was spotless. Her favorite pen was exactly where she had left it on Thursday afternoon. She didn't even look at it. She walked straight past the laminate desk and followed Gabriel through the heavy double doors into the inner sanctum. Gabriel's office was massive, panelled in dark walnut, smelling of leather and old paper. He walked behind his sprawling executive desk and sat down. He pointed to the heavy round mahogany table situated in the corner of the room overlooking the harbour. A new ergonomic chair sat behind it. Stacked neatly in the centre of the table were 6 thick, leather-bound ledgers. The real books. The numbers that dictated the life and death of the Rossi syndicate. The laundering fronts in the garment district are bleeding cash, Gabriel said, booting up his computer. He didn't look at her. It was pure business. The shell corporations are structured wrong. Find the leak. Fix it. Nora walked over to the table. She sat down in the new chair. The lumbar support was, in fact, excellent. She pulled the first ledger toward her, flipping it open with her good hand. "I'll need the tax ID numbers for the trucking subsidiaries," she replied, her voice cold, professional, and entirely devoid of hesitation. For the next 4 hours, the only sounds in the inner office were the scratching of Gabriel's pen and the quiet clicking of Nora's left hand on a calculator. It was an incredibly intimate silence. They were dissecting the anatomy of a criminal empire together. Nora found 3 critical vulnerabilities in the offshore accounts before lunch. Gabriel approved her restructuring plan with a single nod. He trusted her intellect completely. At 1:30 p.m., the heavy wooden doors swung open without a knock. Frankie walked in. His face was the color of wet cement. He didn't look at Nora. He walked straight to Gabriel's desk and planted his hands on the edge. "We have a problem," Frankie said. His voice was tight, strung tight with panic. Gabriel set his pen down slowly. "Report. The city." Frankie swallowed hard. A reporter for the Tribune got a leak from the zoning board. They published the condemnation notices early. Front page of the Metro section online. Pier 4 is officially dead paper as of an hour ago. The silence in the office turned instantly toxic. Nora stopped calculating. Her left hand hovered over the keypad. The timeline was wrong. The municipal filings weren't supposed to hit the public register until the end of the month. A leak. Someone at the zoning board had gotten greedy and sold the tip to a journalist. Gabriel didn't move. His face was a mask carved from stone. Has Paulie seen it? Paulie's guys were down at the pier setting up their lock boxes when the union boss walked up with a printout of the article and told them to get off the property. Frankie said grimly. Paulie knows. He knows you handed him a rotting corpse and told him it was a gold mine. Gabriel leaned back in his leather chair. He looked across the room at Nora. She met his gaze. The analytical part of her brain, the part that organized chaos into neat, manageable columns, was already spinning. The trap had sprung too early. Paulie hadn't had time to cool down from Leo's death. The humiliation was fresh, public, and undeniable. "He's going to hit back," Nora said, her voice cutting through the heavy air. "He can't call another meeting. It makes him look weak twice. He has to respond with violence." "Where?" Gabriel asked her. He didn't ask Frankie. He asked the woman sitting at the mahogany table. "The garment district fronts," Nora said, instantly looking down at the ledgers she had just spent 4 hours analyzing. "We just identified the vulnerabilities. If I can see the structural weakness in those warehouses, Paulie's accountants can too. It's where our cash is most exposed." Gabriel looked at Frankie. "Pull every man off the south side. Consolidate them at the garment warehouses. Lock down the blocks. Nobody gets in or out without my explicit order. Boss, if we pull the muscle off the south side, we leave the casinos completely exposed," Frankie argued, his voice rising. "Do it, Frankie!" Gabriel snapped the volume of his voice, cracking like a whip. "Now!" Frankie turned and practically ran out of the office, pulling his phone from his pocket. Gabriel stood up. He walked over to the corner of his office, opened a hidden compartment in the walnut paneling, and pulled out a matte black tactical shotgun. He checked the chamber with a brutal mechanical efficiency. Nora watched him. The reality of the life she had just chosen was stripping away its clean mathematical veneer. It was turning into blood and cordite. Gabriel walked over to her table. He leaned down, placing his hands on the arms of her chair, boxing her in. His eyes were entirely black, consumed by the violence that was about to break over the city. "You don't leave this room." Gabriel ordered, his voice a lethal whisper. "You lock the doors. You don't open them for anyone but me." Nora looked up at him. She didn't tremble. She reached up, her fingers grazing the hard line of his jaw. "Don't miss." The heavy walnut doors clicked shut. The deadbolt slid into place with a sickening finality. Nora sat in the absolute quiet of the inner office. The silence was heavier now. It pressed against the thick glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows. Below her, the city moved in ignorant rhythmic pulses, completely unaware of the violence spooling up in its concrete arteries. She looked at the leather ledgers stacked neatly on the mahogany table. Gabriel had told her to wait. Gabriel had told her to lock the doors. Nora was not a woman who simply waited. She pulled her laptop forward. Her right hand throbbed beneath the fiberglass splint, a steady, rhythmic ache that ironically sharpened her focus. She opened the encrypted financial network Gabriel used to move millions across international borders. If Paulie Moretti was hitting the garment district, he was committing heavy resources. Men, weapons, vehicles, silence, they all required immediate liquid cash. You didn't run a street war on credit. You paid up front, or men didn't pull the trigger. Nora's left hand flew across the keyboard. She didn't have the authority to order hits. She couldn't fire a shotgun, but she had the routing numbers. It took her 22 minutes to bypass the secondary firewalls on the holding accounts Paulie used to pay his street captains. The digital architecture was sloppy. Leo Moretti had been skimming from these exact accounts for months, which meant the internal security protocols had been quietly degraded to hide his theft. Nora didn't steal the money. That would trigger immediate banking alerts and tracebacks. Instead, she drafted a string of complex, fabricated tax liens using dummy shell corporations. She injected them into the banking mainframe and flagged Paulie's primary accounts for suspected federal fraud. The automated banking algorithms did the rest, acting with ruthless, emotionless efficiency. Within seconds, Paulie Moretti's primary operational funds were frozen, pending an automatic 90-day federal review. Nora hit the enter key. The screen flashed a sterile green confirmation banner. Down on the streets, Paulie's war chest had just evaporated. 4 miles away, the garment district smelled of diesel exhaust and damp asphalt. Gabriel stood in the deep shadow of an alleyway, the tactical shotgun heavy and familiar in his hands. Frankie was crouched 10 feet away behind a rusted industrial dumpster, gripping a matte black rifle. The rain had started again, a fine, freezing mist that slicked the cobblestones. The convoy of unmarked cargo vans arrived exactly when Nora's vulnerability assessment dictated they would. They aggressively pulled up to the loading docks of Gabriel's primary laundering warehouse, the tires screeching against the wet pavement. Gabriel didn't wait for them to deploy. He didn't give a speech. He stepped out of the shadows and fired. The first blast shattered the engine block of the lead van. The sound was deafening, a physical force that cracked the heavy, humid air and echoed violently off the brick facades. Chaos erupted. Paulie's men scrambled out of the crippled vehicles, returning fire blindly into the dark. But Gabriel's crew had the high ground, the angles, and the element of total surprise. It wasn't a prolonged battle. It was a tactical execution. Gabriel moved with a terrifying mechanical grace. He didn't waste movement. He didn't waste ammunition. He was the violent, unavoidable consequence of an old man's pride. A stray bullet grazed the fabric of Gabriel's suit jacket, biting a chunk of brick out of the wall behind him. He didn't flinch. He racked the shotgun, stepped smoothly out from cover, and fired again. Within 4 minutes, the street was quiet. The surviving Moretti enforcers dropped their weapons and ran, abandoning the smoking vans and their wounded. Frankie walked over to the nearest vehicle, kicking a dropped handgun into the storm drain with a dull splash. "We hold the line," Gabriel commanded, his voice perfectly steady over the ringing in his ears. "Clean this up. If Paulie sends a second wave, break them." Gabriel didn't stay to watch the cleanup. He turned and walked back to the waiting SUV. He had to get back to the tower. The digital clock on Nora's desk read 4:17 p.m. The heavy brass handle on the double doors turned. The deadbolt clicked open. Nora stood up. Gabriel walked in. He looked exactly the same as when he had left, except for a dusting of white brick powder on his left shoulder and the harsh metallic scent of fired rounds clinging to the wool of his suit. He placed the shotgun on his desk. He looked across the vast room at her. He didn't ask if she was okay. He could see that she was perfectly fine. "They hit the loading docks," Gabriel said, his voice a low gravel drag. "They didn't get inside. It's over." "I know," Nora replied calmly. She closed her laptop with a soft snap. Paulie just received an automated notification from his Cayman bankers. His primary operating accounts are locked down under federal suspicion. He can't pay the men who just survived your ambush. By tomorrow morning, his captains will defect to avoid a war they aren't getting paid to fight. Gabriel stopped halfway across the room. He stared at her. The residual adrenaline of the gunfight slowly drained from his system, replaced by a profound, overwhelming awe. He walked to the mahogany table. He didn't box her in this time. He reached out and gently took her uninjured left hand, pulling her slowly around the table until she was standing flush against his chest. "You froze his accounts," Gabriel whispered, the realization settling heavily over him. "I flagged them," Nora corrected, softly looking up into his dark eyes. "The money is still there. He just can't touch it. I starved his army." Gabriel let out a ragged breath. He rested his forehead against hers. He had spent his entire life surrounded by men who claimed loyalty, men who fought with muscle and steel. He had never met anyone who fought with such cold, devastating precision. "We broke him," Gabriel said, his hands sliding down to rest heavily on her waist. "We corrected the market," she replied, a faint, genuine smile touching her lips for the very first time. Gabriel kissed her. It wasn't the desperate collision of before. It was a slow, deep claim. It tasted like survival. Nora leaned into him, the throbbing in her hand and the ache in her ribs fading into the background. She was no longer just the secretary. She was the architect, and the king of the city was holding her like she was the only crown that mattered. And that is how you conquer a city, not just with bullets and bravado, but with Ledger's logic and a woman who refuses to be collateral damage. Gabriel and Nora's dynamic completely shifted from the front desk to the throne, proving that the most lethal weapon in the criminal underworld isn't a gun. It's a brilliant mind. If this dark, grounded romance kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Right now, share this video with your friends who crave gritty, intelligent storytelling, and subscribe to the channel for more intense Mafia dramas. Drop a comment below. Who do you think is truly running the Rossi family? Now, Gabriel or Nora?